Welcome to 4sight Friday Roundup, 4sight Health's podcast series for healthcare revolutionaries. Outcomes matter, customers count, and value rules. Hello again, everyone. This is Dave Burda, news editor at 4sight Health. It is Friday, February 18th. The Super Bowl is over. Valentine's Day is over. But season 4 of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel starts tonight on Amazon Prime. See, there is a reason to hang on until March. Speaking of hanging on today's episode of the Roundup, we're going to talk about hospitals and health systems hanging on to their not-for-profit status. Specifically, we're going to talk about a new study in JAMA that compared unreimbursed Medicaid costs between not-for-profit and for-profit hospitals, and a new study in Health Affairs on the compensation of CEOs who run not-for-profit hospitals. To share their thoughts on whether these hospitals are living their mission are Dave Johnson, founder and CEO of 4sight Health, and Julie Murchison, partner at Transformation Capital. Hi, Dave. Hi, Julie. How are you guys doing this morning? Dave?
We're getting hit with another snowstorm, and that, of course, means more shoveling. Really does feel like we've had enough snow already. Spring can't come soon enough for me, Dave.
Dave, can your guns get any bigger, from shoveling? I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, the photographers are out front when I go shoveling. So.
Julie, how about you?
I'm good. And I had this experience this morning that got me all excited when I heard on my daughter's favorite Sirius XM station that Amazon drones were dropping drugs in a certain area of the country. And I thought, oh, good new Amazon news. That's probably building on what they've been doing in that space already. So I come home trying to find the news. I can't find it anywhere. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it seems to me like there's just like there's a lag of research to practice in medicine, there's an enormous lag of when companies are doing something to consumers actually realizing it.
Interesting. I haven't heard that. Dave, have you heard that happening?
I've heard about drone-based drug deliveries. In fact, I saw it in action at the Impact Forum a couple of years ago in Florida, although they weren't able to deliver because the wind was blowing too hard. But it's definitely coming.
It's a thing.
All right. Thank you. Now, before we talk about not-for-profit hospitals, unpaid Medicaid costs, and highly paid CEOs, let's talk about what you're streaming on your TVs in February. Dave, what new shows are you watching, and would you recommend to our listeners?
Well, we just finished watching the first season of Picard on Paramount Plus. Once we got started, resistance was futile. For the uninitiated, that's an inside board joke. The show's narrative centers on the relative merits of human-machine collaboration. That seems very current. Going forward, we're planning to watch 2 4-episode series, Lincoln's Dilemma on Apple TV, and We Need to Talk About Cosby on Showtime. I've heard good things about both of them.
Good choices. Thank you. Julie, how about you? What new shows or seasons are you ready to binge watch?
Well, remember that I have a 13-year-old at home, so we've just completed the series of Marvel movies that she's seen 100 times, and it was my first time through. And we're about to start binge watching the Marvel TV shows, which is very exciting. But when I get my own time at night, I'm going to definitely be binge watching the last season of Ozark. If you haven't seen it, it's quite something.
Yeah, another good suggestion. I'm going to take the high road here and say I'm looking forward to the 4-part CNN series on LBJ, Triumph and Tragedy. But I'll really be watching Mrs. Maisel with my wife. What can I say? All right, let's talk about this new study in JAMA. Researchers from Johns Hopkins, the University of Maryland, and Georgetown compared the unreimbursed Medicaid cost of not-for-profit and for-profit hospitals in 2019. Turns out each segment's unpaid Medicaid cost burden was about the same, even though not-for-profits receive tax breaks in exchange for the community benefits they provide. Unpaid Medicaid bills represented about 2.5% of each side's total expenses that year. Dave, what's your reaction to the study? Are unpaid Medicaid bills a good measure of community benefit? And are not-for-profits earning their preferential tax treatment in exchange for what they do for the poor and the uninsured?
Well, you've asked me 3 questions, Dave. First, what's my reaction to the study? Its findings are accurate, but not at all surprising. This is an old story, but it feels new every time I see it because it gets my dander up. The level of Medicaid volume individual providers cover is a function of geography, not tax status. That's why there's little difference in the levels of unpaid Medicaid bills between nonprofit and for-profit hospitals. Secondly, your second question, are unpaid Medicaid bills a good measure of community benefit? The answer is not at all. It's fuzzy math. The loss is relative to standard charges, which is a made up and inflated number. Overall, the American Hospital Association, and we can't trust what they say on these things, estimates that 70% of community benefit arises from losses associated with treating Medicare, Medicaid, and means-tested government programs. Society doesn't allow for-profit hospitals, like you said, Dave, to claim these benefits. The exercise of calculating community benefit is riddled with hypocrisy. Paraphrasing Shakespeare, the devil can quote mission statements for its own purposes. Your final question, is society getting a good deal by subsidizing nonprofit hospitals? The answer again here is a resounding no. The JAMA study referenced a 2015 analysis led by Sarah Rosenblum of Georgetown that calculated the cost of tax exemption for nonprofit hospitals to be $25 billion, give or take, in 2011. I discussed the report's findings with Sarah a couple of years ago. Her studies excluded potential lost tax revenues from investment income, capital gains, and asset sales. Those are all forms of non-operating income and can be quite sizable. Inflate the 2011 figures to current dollars, add in lost tax revenues from non-operating income, and the societal cost of tax exemption grows to over $40 billion annually this year. That's a big number, roughly equivalent to the amount spent each year on new healthcare facilities and double the annual budget of the National Institutes of Health. But the true societal costs of subsidizing nonprofit healthcare are much higher than $40 billion. Nonprofit hospitals operate less efficiently than for-profit hospitals. This drives up costs. Brand name nonprofit hospitals usually charge the highest prices in town, which inflates their community benefit calculations. Plus, health systems are getting bigger, not better, through acquisitions. This increases their leverage in negotiating payment rates with commercial health insurers. That's another principal driver of rising healthcare costs, which burden all Americans. It would be a whole lot less complicated, if you ask me, if nonprofit providers just paid taxes the way for-profit providers do. They could retain their nonprofit status and pursue mission-based activities. But at least then society wouldn't be getting the short end of the stick.
Got it. We all have to pay taxes, Dave. Thank you. Julie, any comments or questions for Dave?
So Dave, I love your tax idea, but the lobby behind the nonprofits is not weak. So what else could we do and define into this? As I was reading about this, I just couldn't help myself but think about social determinants and how slowly a lot of these hospitals and health systems have actually even gone down the line of providing some transportation here and there, or really thinking about housing. So what else could there be that they could actually define into this?
Well, you've heard me say this a bunch of times, Julie. We're not going to change the way we deliver healthcare until we change the way we pay for healthcare. And that's why payment reform is so important. When we start paying for outcomes, then suddenly value-based care makes sense. And if we reward hospitals and providers for preventing unnecessary admissions and for catching disease earlier and for providing holistic care, they'll start doing it. One other thing I'd like to say about tax exemption, it's not a universal good for the health systems that benefit from it. It comes with strings too. A couple of years ago, Politico did a hatchet job on academic medical centers. Title of the article was something like, "Academic medical centers doing great under Obamacare, but their neighborhoods aren't doing anywhere near as well." Something like that. So it isn't enough for these hospitals to provide great clinical care, train the next generation of doctors, and conduct path-breaking research. They also have to engage in workforce development, neighborhood revitalization, and community empowerment. Their job's already hard enough. I actually think it might be easier to run these organizations if they didn't have to worry about the community benefit. I mean, Political or nobody ever writes these stories about HCA. So pay your taxes and make life easier. One other quick point about nonprofit healthcare is there's a real structural issue. In for-profit healthcare, the board and management own stock and have a long-term interest in the success of the company. In nonprofit healthcare, the boards are generally volunteer or receive a small stipend. Anyway, they don't have a financial interest in the success of the organization. And management's usually on short-term contracts. And that means they tend to be more risk averse and feel they can only get into trouble by pushing the envelope too far. So another answer to your question about social determinants is it's a little riskier than just maintaining the status quo. And it's the exceptional leaders, not the common ones, that are really willing to push that kind of reform.
Thanks, Dave. I think they should just stop putting liens on people's houses, right? That would be a good place to start. Now let's talk about this new and related study in health affairs. 3 executives from the Loan Institute, a Boston-based think tank, commented on data that compared the compensation of the top executive at a not-for-profit hospital with the compensation of hospital staff without advanced degrees working at the same hospital. They found that on average in 2018, CEOs made 8 times the hourly wage of their workers on staff. The researchers said, as hospital policies and culture have become more aligned with big business, hospital executive compensation has swelled. Instead, they said, CEO compensation should be based on the value that the hospital creates for its community. Julie, what's your take on this piece in health affairs? Do you agree with the authors? Why not? And is there a better way to pay not-for-profit hospital CEOs?
Well, aside from what I read in this report, I'm sure the data is probably directionally correct, but whether or not you agree with the authors is probably based on the degree to which you support free market thinking. And honestly, I sit a little bit on the fence on these issues, probably politically. It occurred to me that I wanted to really look at what's happening in other industries, since the authors talk about how other industries are comps that are really creating a driver for this. So what I found was in August of 2021, the Economic Policy Institute said that CEO pay skyrocketed 1,322% since 1978. So that's kind of amazing. And this is across, publicly owned companies, basically. And of 350 of these public companies, CEOs were paid 351 times as much as your typical worker in 2020. So this is public companies, not healthcare specific. CEOs were paid 351 times as much as a typical worker. The AFL-CIO found that the average CEO of an S&P 500 company made 299 times more money than the median employee. So these are the non-healthcare comps, or maybe comps that might include a few healthcare companies, but they're all public companies. And this report, that you referred to here, Dave, says that nonprofit hospital CEOs make an average of 8 times more than their hourly employees. And some nonprofit CEOs are paid twice the rate of other workers. Some are paid 60 times the rate of other workers. So when you look at the free market comparison kind of theory, healthcare is doing pretty well, I have to say. But I know that's not what this is about, nor should it be, because we're looking at these issues for an industry that needs to cut costs for the good of Americans and deliver better care. So the proposed solutions that sort of work on the corporate side really are about taxes, not unlike what Dave recommends in the last discussion. And these may or may not be, effective approaches for nonprofit hospitals, because those are all about implementing higher marginal income tax rates or reducing incentives like that cause these executives to push higher and higher for their pay. So who makes these decisions in nonprofit hospitals if it's not about kind of taxes? And that is absolutely the board of directors. And who's the kind of one body at each of these nonprofit hospitals that doesn't understand the transformation that's happening in healthcare today? I would argue it's the nonprofit boards of directors. So these are people who are made up of largely folks in the community who give philanthropically to hospitals, and they come from almost every industry but healthcare. So they think differently. They don't necessarily understand the complexities of healthcare. They're diving in and out of board meetings without necessarily understanding the industry, and much less the huge technology shift it's going through, although I'm sure that some of those folks are super helpful because of other industries they're in that have gone through technological change. But when I was at Health Evolution, we worked with Mark Gans, who formerly ran Cambia, and Ron Williams, who formerly ran Aetna, to help CEOs at Health Evolution understand how to manage their boards better. How do they turn their boards over to find people who can actually really be strong governance leaders? How do they better educate their boards about what's happening in healthcare? And until these boards understand the risks that health systems are in, and I'm talking about like the risks of their core business, right? They won't understand how to incentivize CEOs or management teams in any other way other than volume-based pricing, since to Dave's point, that's largely our reimbursement system, or benchmarking to other industries, which we're clearly sort of nowhere near those levels. So I think so much of this is really about governance, honestly.
Got it. Thanks, Julie. And great industry comparisons on the ratios. That's very interesting. Dave, any comments or questions for Julie?
Well, Julie's spot on that the trend in healthcare compensation between CEOs and regular workers reflects the broader trend in American society. There is one complicating factor, and it's very hard to capture the deferred compensation portion of senior executives in health systems in these kinds of analyses. So that 8 times is probably understating the actual ratio. I'm sure it's at least double that. That's just something to take into consideration. But I'm a markets guy, and I actually wouldn't care what we paid CEOs if the organizations actually delivered what Julie was talking about earlier, which is better outcomes, lower costs, better customer experience. But it's that mismatch between what we need and what we get that I think is the most galling part of the whole compensation discussion. Julie, my question for you is, we interviewed Jim Elrod from Vestar this week for an article we're writing with Kane Brothers on investment trends. He's an old friend of mine. We went to college together, and he's also, like me, a grizzled healthcare veteran, maybe like all of us. So discussing health systems, Jim said they're, quote, play acting when it comes to pursuing value-based care services. And so my question for you, Julie, is, do you agree with Jim regarding health systems and how they're pursuing value-based care, play acting? And if so, does the nonprofit governance status of most health systems and maybe some of the board dynamics that you described exacerbate the problem?
I talked this week to one of the leading pioneer ACOs in that original group, and to hear the simplicity with which they were able to achieve some of the greatest, financial returns in that pioneer program, and they were just scratching the surface, right? When you know how to do it and you do it well, it actually doesn't take too much to move the needle to make money in that business. So that says to me that anyone who's actually doing it is doing it going down the road of diversification of the business and doing just enough to be able to learn and actually figure out how to run a profitable business without giving up the cash cow. So yes, value-based care is a bit challenging to even calculate for a lot of systems, right? So if boards can't look at numbers that make sense and see trends and momentum and the like, and no one is actually forcing the organization to do it, then that's not, it's not going to go anywhere. So I think I would agree with that. Although I will say there are plenty of leaders out there who are sharpening their pencils and getting this right, because I think a lot of them know the day is coming.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, we really don't hear that insider baseball stuff very often. That's really interesting in that they know how to do it, they're dabbling in it, and they're just scratching the surface of what they know could be done. Now, I'd be curious to see the wage ratio between publishers and reporters as a journalist, and I bet it would be way worse than at not-for-profit hospitals. So that's my POV right there. All right, great discussion. Now let's briefly talk about other big stories this past week. Julie, what other healthcare news caught your attention this week and why?
I was definitely not totally surprised, but captivated by the fact that the company Roe just raised an increased $7 billion valuation. And while that was, I think, a largely insider round who can have a lot of influence on where they tag that valuation, there's just something funny about Roe's core market and the fact that it can be so big.
That's great. Thank you. Dave, what other healthcare news should our listeners be thinking about this week?
Well, given this week's topic, I find it interesting that a group of Connecticut citizens has filed a class action lawsuit against Hartford Health for having monopoly pricing power to, and I quote, extract higher prices from insurers, employers, and patients. If this lawsuit is successful, it could have a major impact on market dynamics in select communities across the country. So stay tuned on that one.
Yeah, if they're certified as a class and they win, I mean, that law firm's going to be going from city to city. That'll be very interesting to watch. Thanks, Dave, and thank you, Julie. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to learn more about the topics we discussed on today's show, please visit our website at 4sighthealth.com. You also can find a recording of this podcast and all our podcasts on the Healthcare Now Radio Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other streaming services. Subscribe now and don't miss another segment of the best 20 minutes in healthcare. Thanks for listening. I'm Dave Berta for 4sight Health.